In an earlier study that I've done, this was actually something that we looked at directly. So we were working together with a charity in Denmark. It's one of the largest charities across, and they raise money for all different kinds of purposes, but a lot also help people in Africa. This was this particular charity campaign we were working with. And they were very convinced that, well, if they gave people the information that they could donate to this particular cause, they gave them a lot of time to donate, then eventually people would just come around to donating. Well, what we actually saw in that experiment is no matter how long we made the deadline for donations, whether it was 3 days or 10 days or 34 days, it really didn't matter. If we sent out an email, people either donated immediately or they forgot about it. We did this by text message as well, same effect. Either people responded immediately or they didn't respond at all. So it didn't really matter what the information was in general, but it mattered much more as when was people's attention triggered to carry out a particular action. So as I said, I think companies have known this for a very long time, that our attention is extremely valuable and that gathering our attention is really what brings them a profit and how they build their business models. But I think when it comes to policymaking, this is something that only recently, maybe in the 10, 15 years, it's something that we've talked about a bit more. So those of you who've heard about this idea of nudging, behaviorally informed policy, you might recognize a couple of these nudges that I put up on the screen here. So we have home energy reports telling people their energy consumption compared to their neighbors. We have signs in hotel rooms telling people to reuse their towels. We have in the lower corner a picture which says keep distance. So this is now from the pandemic. Stickers on the supermarket grounds telling people to keep their distance from the next person. Or we have criminal court appearance tickets or reminders that were sent out in order to remind people that they had to go to court at a particular point in time. Actually, all of these nudges became quite prominent because they showed that we could change people's behavior by drawing attention to something that they were supposed to be doing or how they were potentially compared to any of their neighbors. So for those of you who are maybe not that familiar with nudging, just thought I'll bring up the definition, right? So nudging are interventions that affect behavior in a predictable way without changing economic incentives or the available options. Right? So and most of these nudges, I would claim, even though they have slightly different mechanisms, many of them actually do work by steering our attention to a particular decision environment. So what we can use nudges for is that we can help them to improve other types of, for example, economic incentives or other types of policy tools. For example, in the case of the court appearance, if people didn't appear to court when they had to, they were getting a huge fine. And what the study showed is that, well, people did want to appear to court, and also the fine was a big problem to them, but it could still be that they just forgot when the court date was. So making that more salient and reminding them at the right point of time actually was a great complement to the incentive and the mandates that we already had. But there's a big difference between companies that try to maximize our or try to attract our attention and policymakers or governments that want to steer our attention. So what is this big difference? Well, for most companies, it's just important that they can maximize the attention on their product, right? So the more somebody pays attention to them, the better. The higher up you're on Google in the search, the better. The more time you spend on Facebook, the better for them. So that's quite clear and easy that they just want to increase attention by as much as possible. But when we think about steering attention from a policy perspective, we actually have to think about maximizing a different maximization function here. So here we now actually want to think about, well, how do we maximize the welfare of our citizens by steering or distributing attention optimally? Do we want them to think about savings, or should they think about their health insurance? Should they do their homework with their kids, or should they exercise? Should they pay attention to calorie labels, or maybe to saving electricity in their homes? So to think about this, it now actually turns into a much more complicated situation that we have to think about. How do we steer people's attention to the right things but without also distracting it from other things that they might want to think about. So for the talk today, I want to talk about two areas of research that I've been working on most. So two types of nudges that steer our attention. One of them are reminders. So these can be text messages, emails, other types of physical reminders, and then the concept of salience. So if you have a particular type of menu, for example, or something on the internet or a particular sign, how to increase attention to a particular feature of that menu or of that sign compared to something else. But I'll start talking a little bit about reminders and what we have to think about it when we think about these questions as policymakers. So the first thing we can say here is that we know reminders work to change behavior by focusing attention. So I think this is really by now very uncontroversial. If we send a reminder, it's more likely that people will carry out a particular type of action. There's hundreds of studies of this. I think some of the most prominent ones I brought here are a study by Carlin et al., who shows that if people get reminders to save, they're more likely to save. My colleague here at the department, Stefan Altman, is working on dentist appointments. So if people are reminded to set up a dentist appointment, they're more likely to do it. Older paper by Hakan Mazur, if people are reminded to give to charity, they're more likely to give to charity. I think that dimension is very clear, that if we send reminders, there's more likely that people will actually do this. But the question then arises is, well, when and how often should people be reminded? In an earlier paper by Hakan Mazur, well, they talk about this idea of transaction cost theory. So sometimes I might feel generous, or I have a lot of extra time. So if I'm reminded at that point of time, it's more likely that I'm going to give, because it's just easier for me, the opportunity costs are lower. Other times I might be very stressed, I might be on my way to work, so it's not possible to give, so then I won't do this. So because these transaction costs vary for different people and over time, we don't really know when the transaction costs in general are low. So one consequence of this theoretical model and this way of thinking could then be, well, in order to maximize donations and in order to maximize action, we should just remind people all the time, every 3 minutes, until they carry out the behavior. If we think about it that way, it probably is not a good idea to do it like that. Right? We already intuitively feel that probably we do not want to be reminded, no matter how important the situation is or the action is, every 5 minutes. So this was also something that my colleague Mette Damgat and I started thinking about, when I thought, well, to think about these theoretical models we have right now about donation behavior and about reminders, there isn't really any end point to them, but somehow intuitively we know there must be something that stops us from reminding people all the time. So again, we teamed up with the same charity. So again, the charity working in Denmark collecting money. So they're similar to the Red Cross in their aims. And what we wanted to see is, okay, if we send out reminders, are people going to donate more? And that's also what we find. Every time we send a reminder, we also got more donations. So here we replicated the literature. But what was quite surprising is that also every time we sent out a reminder, the unsubscriptions also increased. So here we had then some idea that there was something that was this negative effect from being reminded. So we now had a revealed preference measure showing that there were some types of annoyance costs, or people were reacting negatively to getting these reminders. So what we then do in that paper is we develop a theoretical model where we try to think a bit more about, okay, what is it really that holds this, the fact that people still maybe want to be on a mailing list, but then also don't want to be reminded too much. Because all the people we had sent emails to in this experiment, they had originally signed up to be on the mailing list of this charity. So it wasn't that we were just cold emailing people who just had no interest to give. All of the people we were reminding to give had previously donated, sometimes even for several times over several years. So what we look at then is then this question about this trade-off between being annoyed by receiving a reminder, but on the other hand, also having this fear of missing out. that if you don't receive a reminder, you're going to forget. As we've seen in the first experiment with the charity, right? Only if they received a reminder would they actually donate. And assuming that people have some positive utility from donating, which we call warm glow, then that is something that's an action that they would actually want to do. But you can think about this model also in other types of situations, such as maybe going to the gym. So maybe, yeah, it's effortful to go to the gym, but I might forget it if I don't get reminded. But on the other hand, I also don't want to get reminded too much because that would be too annoying. So what we then did in second round of the experiment is that we, in order to test this theory, we wanted to see, well, if we reduce the anticipated annoyance cost by receiving reminders, or if we increase the anticipated benefit of staying on this mailing list and being reminded, would that decrease unsubscriptions? And that's also what we see in this experiment. The only difference we had here was in the PS of the solicitation email, we told one group in this randomized controlled trial that we would send them just one reminder instead of 3 in the next 3 months. And the other group, we told that the next time, if they were still on the mailing list, there was a special offer for people who were already subscribing. As predicted, this had no effect on donations, but it did decrease significantly in both cases the amount of unsubscriptions compared to a basic control group. So this was some evidence for our theory that this is really the trade-off that people are making, the idea of not wanting to or anticipating these annoyance costs in the future, but on the other hand, not wanting to miss out on being reminded. In addition to these revealed preferences that we measured, we also looked at stated preferences. So for some of the people, we just asked them when they unsubscribed and we said, okay, so why did you unsubscribe? And what we find there is also that people think there are too many emails from the charity, but also this idea that they just dislike being asked. So this, again, kind of annoyance cost of having somebody else remind you to do something. And then, of course, there were a couple of people, as you see from the first bar, who just didn't want to give to the charity anymore. So this really had nothing to do with the reminders, but I think several of the other reasons for unsubscribing can be clearly connected with this idea of just not wanting to be reminded, but not actually not wanting to give to the charity. What we do then is that we do a welfare estimation. So we structurally estimate the model to see what is actually these, so what is the extent of these negative costs that, that come up by receiving these reminders. And what we find is that when we do the welfare estimation, both for the receivers of the reminders, but also then for the charity, is that if we don't account for these hidden costs, then we're vastly overstating the benefits of the reminders. Because if we just look at the positive behavior change, which is something that a lot of these randomized controlled trials we see, especially within nudging, often measure, just like how many people positively change behavior. And we're not accounting for the fact that all the people who do not give, and maybe also the ones who give, but who feel a bit annoyed by the email, if we don't take that into consideration, then we think that, we have just these positive welfare effects. So in this, for this particular setting, we almost overstate the welfare effects by a factor of 10. But also for the charity, this can become problematic. Depending on how patient or impatient the charity is, losing that many people by unsubscribing, by sending too many reminders in quick succession can be a net negative effect for the charity, unless they are very impatient, right? So they need a lot of money very quickly and also have the opportunity to quickly recruit new donors. Especially in the charitable giving case, I know that most charities have a hard time attracting new donors and really want to try keeping their old donors. So I think here, most of them are actually not that impatient, so that it would not be a negative effect. So moving on from that work to more recent work that we've done. So what I've just presented, that's already published, but some recent work that we're working on currently now is then an experiment where we wanted to see, well, how do reminders actually affect behavior? Because there can be different channels of how reminders affect our thinking, and those can differently trigger also these annoyance costs that we experience when we receive a reminder. So one idea would be that a reminder just shifts our attention. It shifts it from something else where we're doing to something else. So then we might not feel bad about it, or there's no new information gained. But we could also think about that a reminder actually changes our beliefs about how important an action is, either by providing additional information or just by conveying that it's an important issue, which is a different channel then. Or it could be that a reminder actually creates this feeling of guilt or pressure. Right? So if a colleague sends you this email and asks you, well, how far are you with the paper? Have you done the revision? Or you have to do a referee report and you haven't done it yet, and you get the reminder that it's due in 3 days, even though you had 3 months to do it, then it might not just be increasing attention on an issue, but it might also be changing how you feel about the issue and whether you feel guilty or pressured that you should be doing something. So in this particular experiment, we wanted then to see, okay, how can we design an experiment where we could net out these 3 different channels so that we can get a better understanding of, first of all, how can we design more effective reminders, but also how can we potentially reduce the annoyance cost from these reminders by maybe taking out channels that potentially create guilt, but are maybe not even that effective in actually changing behavior. So for that, we needed to separate out these channels. The way that we do this is that now we're actually moving away from Denmark and to South Africa. So here we connected with a local NGO called Mom Connect. And Mom Connect is actually one of the largest mobile health programs in the world. So in South Africa, this Mom Connect program connects about 60% of all pregnant women all across the country. So almost all public health clinics are signed up to this program. And the way it works is that mothers, once they go to the doctor for the first time and pregnancy is confirmed, they're asked to sign up for this mobile health system. And it's relatively popular and also across all types of socioeconomic groups. So we thought this was a great situation to test this new model at, because in the previous experiment, it was maybe still a bit more, we were reminded to do something for somebody else. But now in this case, we could actually test reminders that were really mostly beneficial for yourself. Because what we're looking at here is that we're looking at pregnant women and sending them reminders to take their prenatal vitamins, in particular iron medication. So anemia is quite a problem in these areas and all over the world for most pregnant women, but particularly in this area. And the South African Department of Health really clearly states that they want the women to take these prenatal vitamins, and they're also available for free all over the country. So again, we developed a theoretical model, which I'm not going to go into today, in order to look at the different channels. And then we ran this field experiment with over 4,000 women across the country in South Africa to test our model predictions. What we do in particular here is that we exogenally vary the types of reminders and the frequency of reminders to take the iron supplements. So here I have a stylized overview of the experiment. We have one control track, and in this control track, we invite women to take part in this text message-based experiment. Everything just goes over phone, so just basic text message technology, so that we had the opportunity to really reach a large group of women. We asked them to consent to taking part in the experiment, and we elicit their beliefs about how important they think it is to take prenatal vitamins. And we do a quiz with them to understand, okay, what is actually their baseline knowledge about the importance of vitamins. And then we have different treatments where we either just send them very pure reminders. So this would mean just, good morning, mom, have you taken your vitamins today? Or hi, remember to take your vitamins. So these reminders really have no additional informational content or anything else, but just are supposed to trigger their remembering of taking vitamins. In comparison to that, we then also have informational reminders. So these reminders give reasons for why women should be taking the vitamins, or tell them about how to take them in a better way. And then we have a treatment that's supposed to increase this potentially feeling of guilt, or at least emotional utility from taking the vitamins. And that's where we sent the women this emotional prompt where we asked them to think about and to make a promise to the unborn child that they're going to do their best to live a healthy life and take the prenatal vitamins to do the best what's for themselves and their baby. So we do that for a couple of weeks. And then afterwards, we measure again in a quiz whether their knowledge has changed about prenatal vitamins. We do a survey where we ask them different types of demographic information and also their stated adherence. And then we have a willingness to pay task where we actually give them some money in form of airtime. And then we ask them whether they're willing to pay for additional reminders. So for another 2 weeks. So they can keep the money if they just say, no, I want to keep the money, then they get this as airtime. But if they do want to pay for these reminders, then some of that money will be deducted and then they will receive daily reminders. So here we have a second outcome variable then to see, okay, how much are these reminders actually in demand? And the whole experiment ran for approximately 3 months. So what we see from this experiment is that compared to our other study, the response to the reminders here was actually overwhelmingly positive. Our first planned outcome variable, and that was unsubscriptions from our mailing list, from our text messages, was that only 23 out of the over 4,000 women that opted into the experiment actually unsubscribed. So great for the program, not so great for our experimental test, but that's how it goes. Based on power calculations we had done previously and also talk with the NGO, they said, oh, there's going to be so many people unsubscribing and we want to be really careful that we don't lose too many during the experiment. But for some reason, they did like our reminders. So we had very low unsubscriptions here. Even 2 months after opting in, 82% of the women were still responding to our messages, which compared to other types of studies, I'm sure there's plenty of people in the audience who run RCTs in these areas and on these topics know that is quite a high response rate. But based on these outcomes, we could actually not find any differential engagement between the treatments. So here we haven't learned that much yet about the different value of the different reminders, other than generally they seem to like them. But what we do find is that all the reminders had a positive effect on behavior change. So of course we can only look at stated adherence. It's not possible to draw the blood of 40,000 women across South Africa, at least not with whose budgets I have for research. But based on their stated adherence and then comparing the different treatments to each other, so even if the level effects aren't exactly right, but we do get an idea of whether there's differences in treatments, we find that stated adherence is relatively high in general, and that reminders also increase adherence. But what was surprising to find is that the additional information actually had a negative effect compared to the pure reminders. Adding this positive emotional or adding this emotional prompt had a slight positive effect on adherence. And adding any type of controls this holds. But this was already the first finding that kind of went against our initial hypothesis, where we thought that providing information and telling people why it's important actually to take these prenatal vitamins would have a positive effect. But here we clearly find it is negative. We then find the same result also in our willingness to pay elicitation. So what we can y-axis, we see the share of respondents. So how many people wanted to keep the reminders. And then what I can now glance over is we did this willingness to pay in a multiple price list method. So we can think about, okay, at different price levels, how many women are willing to pay the reminders. And when they have to pay 5 South African South African rand, then we actually see that if they have previously received reminders, more of the women were willing to pay for more reminders. So we see here that there was actually clearly positive demand effect of having been exposed to reminders compared to the control group. But again, we see that there's this negative effect, negative marginal effect of information. That was actually then lower than the control group. We then again do a structural estimation in order to understand better what how these annoyance costs are updated over time of the experiment. Again, I'm not going to have enough time to go into the basic details, but what we see here, and this is very new work, so my co-author has just been programming this the last couple of days, is that we find that the women on average start out with relatively low annoyance costs. We see that also from not that many unsubscriptions, but there is quite a high variation across people about how annoyed they are with receiving these reminders. But what we find here is that, at least for the pure reminders, people seem to update positively as they are exposed to the reminders. So they think that the reminders are more annoying than they actually are. So they seem to learn the value of these reminders over time. So what have we learned also looking at these two papers together? So for doing welfare maximizing policy, we need to look at more than just behavior change. So this is not just something that's just relevant for reminders, but is also relevant for any type of other work we might be doing. I think very often we focus on a particular behavior we want to change, but not really what else is going on when we're changing that behavior. In the first one, if we had just looked at the number of donations, we would have missed these annoyance costs and the amount of unsubscriptions. And in the second paper, we would have assumed that the reminders didn't really work and were useless because there was just very little change in adherence. But when we look at this willingness to pay, we see that there's actually the reminders reduced this mental cost of keeping track. So this is something that is not really visible to see when we just looked at the behavior change, but it was only something that we could deduct from looking at this willingness to pay and also looking at having our theoretical model to inform this. So even if there's no large observable behavior change, this willingness to pay elicitations show that the reminders are valuable to the women and that they might actually want to keep them. So using these structural estimations also then allows for more elaborate welfare estimations. So that was a bit on the question of reminders and how do we actually see whether reminders are, first of all, positive for changing behavior, but then also what are these potentially hidden costs of reminders, and are these reminders actually desired by the ones we're trying to remind? Do we think they're helpful or not? We found that information, even though we might think that that is actually something that could be very valuable, or as classical economists, we might think, well, I mean, why don't people just ignore the information? I mean, just getting the information for free shouldn't really have a negative effect, but we do found that that has negative impact. But now I want to switch a bit and talk a little bit more about the questions of salience and how have we looked at that in my work, and how does that actually steer attention in a different way? And then also go a bit into the question of the ethics of steering attention. So in this paper, study that I've done together with my colleague Verena Kurz, which we did in a Swedish restaurant. That's why if you can't read the text, this is in Swedish here. So what it shows is that we did an experiment in a local restaurant, and we were interested in understanding what is the effect of having the vegetarian option come first on the menu and saying at the bottom there's also a meat alternative, or having the meat alternative come at the top and saying at the bottom that there's also a vegetarian alternative. The menu on the left, the one that has first meat and then fish for different days of the week, and then says that they also have a vegetarian alternative, that is the classic menu that this restaurant has been using for quite some time. And then our treatment menu that we then randomized into different places into the restaurant is this vegetarian and fish menu. So luckily the restaurant was super open to do this experiment with us. So what we did is just depending on where people were sitting down in the restaurant, we assigned either one of the menus or the other menu, and then the waiters recorded what people were ordering. So when it comes to the question of meat consumption, there's a lot of people feel they have very strong preferences, and that if you ask them in a survey, most people would argue that their preferences aren't shifted by where something comes on the menu. So what do we find? Maybe I should also mention the prices were exactly the same for all three options. Well, what we find in this study is that in the regular situations and the normal menu, approximately 50% of the customers chose meat and 50% of the customers chose a fish dish. And really just by day, maybe 1% chose a vegetarian dish. So really only the true vegetarians, it's not a vegetarian restaurant, only the true vegetarians ordered the vegetarian food. But if we look at the other menu, there only 20% of people chose meat, 60% of people chose fish, and another 20% of people chose the meat alternative. So what we can also learn from this is that obviously, even if we do try to shift attention, yes, we can move a group of people. So we moved about 20% who now choose vegetarian food, but compared to the 1% who choose vegetarian food previously, the 20% who now choose meat, there is this stronger preference to consume meat in this particular setting, and they're more likely to actually look down the menu and find that meat is also available. I should also say here, these red bars, they were not on the original menu. They're just here for illustrative purposes. But why am I telling you about this particular experiment? Well, what's different here is that it's a really subtle nudge. So there's actually not anything that is obviously drawing attention, but is more that by not drawing attention, that we are shifting how people are making choices. And this is something that we've discussed in a recent paper that we published in the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, where we think about the use of nudges as environmental policy instruments, but the lessons we learn here, I think, are also applicable to any other types of nudges when we have this public good type of character. So what we do here is that we think about dividing the types of nudges into either pure nudges or what we call moral nudges. So the idea of pure nudges is that we don't really realize that we're being nudged at the point of time when we're being nudged. So these are nudges that might correct inattention, for a particular bias, for internality, and the types of nudges that classify as this would be a simplification, a default effect, right? You just defaulted into one group and you didn't really think about it. Changes in the physical environment, what comes first in the buffet line, and occasionally also particular types of reminders. And this is contrast to moral nudges, which work by creating some kind of decision disutility or some psychological reaction to being nudged. So these would be things such as social proof. When you're told 9 out of 10 people have already paid their taxes, but you haven't, then there is an emotional reaction that happens at that point of time. So you are aware that somebody is trying to affect your behavior here. Things like commitment devices or goal setting or particular type of feedback would also fall under this category. So you realize that somebody's trying to change your behavior. So why do you think this is important to classify? There's plenty more in the paper, but I think an important question here is that, well, if we would now imagine, okay, if we would use that type of a different type of nudge, a type of moral nudge in order to change attention, such, for example, things that have been used in menus, such as 2000. Here, for example, it says, oh, if you choose the meat, then this is equivalent to having your light bulb on for 2000 minutes, then it's more likely that there's going to provoke a psychological reaction and also create a backlash. Let's see about, yes, just about the time. That's perfect. All right. So the difference here, right? So what I want to get at here is then this question of, okay, well, if we, is it always the best idea that when we try to nudge people, or that we try to point them to information and that we try to get them to cognitively think about a particular situation? Or is it maybe better that if we just rearrange the menu and this is a bit more subtle nudge? Very many times when I discuss this with policymakers, Bobby mentioned that I've also been doing some consulting work. Very often the question comes up and says, yeah, but isn't it more ethical and transparent and better for the individual to be more attentive? So if we're trying to change their behavior, shouldn't they be fully conscious that we are doing this? And I fully agree. In several situations, this is probably important and it can have also very positive effects. This is a very recent study. We've ran the study now in the spring of 2021. Together with several supermarket chains in Sweden, we tried to understand what is the effect of quantity offers on purchasing behavior and then on household food waste. So the idea was here, again, apologize if these is Swedish here. So it says 2 for 30 kroners. That would be like 2 for $3. For example, cucumbers. So 2 cucumbers for $3. So are people then just going to buy 2 of those? And what we wanted to look at is we contrast that with 2 for $3, but with a little nudge that tells you, well, only take me home if you're actually going to eat me, or 2 for $3, but saying, oh, but one actually costs $1.60, and or just telling them 1 for what do I say now, $3, so 1 for $1.50. Whether that, so kind of breaking their attention by making the salience, the reference price more salient, by adding this nudge, whether that would have an effect on behavior. And working with the supermarkets, and I have to say, even myself, I was actually quite surprised to see the effects here on screen. So this is compared to the 2 for $3 offer. We randomly assigned the different signs to different supermarkets. We see that actually in the, for example, 1 for 15 offer, 18% less products were sold over the 2-week period of the experiment. So we actually have huge effects here, even though as economists, we think, well, it shouldn't really matter, right? The prices are the same and all the conditions for, in all cases, you pay $3 for 2 things. So it shouldn't really matter. It's not a difficult decision. You're just buying a cucumber in a store, which you do every week, probably for many years of your life. But still, we see that there's such a huge difference, whether we break people's attention and get them to think about, do we actually need to buy that? Or whether they just go and go after this offer without really thinking. So I think here we would claim, okay, does that actually make sense? And maybe we also need to protect consumers by reminding them of or making things more salient so they can take better decisions. But now I want to show you one example where I'm not sure if you would agree that this is actually welfare improving, that we get this much transparency and attention. I don't know if you can maybe guess what it is, but if you've been on the internet, then I'm pretty sure you've seen things like these. All these wonderful, please agree to the cookies pop-ups that we get on every single website. Again, the idea is here that they want to be transparent. It's at least in Europe, the law that these have to come up. And then you need to say, yes, I'm aware that you will trace my behavior. Yes, I'm accepting to this. Maybe it's just me, but I think my welfare would be improved if I didn't have to click on all these things every single time I open a website, especially not on a mobile phone. And then if we think about it, also all these types of different things that I can choose from, and where I'm often then also nudged to, also performance, safe and close. So kind of trying to get me to choose the cookies that are actually optimal for them. I'm not sure anymore that is actually welfare inclusive. So to summarize, what have we learned, hopefully, about steering attention from the work I've done? First of all, attention is costly. So both as policymakers and as academics running studies, we need to really think about trading off drawing attention to something and also avoiding the annoyance costs. Even if they're very well intended, reminders to the wrong group can be welfare decreasing. So this idea that nudging is just costless and we can just add it everywhere is maybe not as simple as we maybe saw it a couple of years ago. Too much information can definitely be welfare decreasing. Sometimes just a pure reminder might be the better option. And sometimes also these subtle pure nudges that just rearrange the decision environment without drawing our attention might be preferable to transparent nudges. But of course, if necessary, we need to also think about regulation that can protect consumers' attention or lack of attention from the interest of private companies. I think a couple of, plenty of still open questions. A couple of them that I'm particularly interested in is, of course, the question of what are the spillover effects? What happens if my attention is drawn to one thing? What do I then don't do if I think about one thing? Can individuals correctly anticipate whether reminders are beneficial to them? So if you have to set them up on your phone, Is that as good as if somebody else reminds you? Can we correctly anticipate how forgetful we are? And especially, I think this question about, okay, how do we balance this question of ethical and well-intended informed attention to the idea of annoyance cost and just too much attention in general? And with that, thank you for your attention. And now I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Christina. This was really, really very interesting. We have collected some questions. Some came from YouTube. We're broadcasting this in YouTube. Some came from there and some others from the audience. Let me start with one of the longest question. I will read what I received.
Oh, I don't hear you.
Sorry, I will start with a long question and comment. They say, thank you for the interesting presentation. I am interested in the heterogeneity in terms of different types of products or services for which we may wish to issue reminders. For example, it seems that you are talking much about positive utility reminders, as in reminding people to do things such as charitable donations, which give them positive utility. However, some of the examples you gave at the beginning seem more about avoiding further disutility, such as showing up for a court date or filling a tax return for something which is already unpleasant. So the question is, do you think these different types of things for which you may have to issue reminders affects the response to or the annoyance of these reminders? For example, I can imagine that reminders to do an unpleasant, costly task could be more annoying than reminders to do a pleasant, warm, glow task. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. I guess one very important part is also how important is it to eventually do the behavior, right? Showing up in court. If I don't show up in court, I'm really in trouble. If I don't give to charity, it's maybe not great. I don't get this positive utility, but nothing really bad is going to happen. So even though one is maybe a negative behavior, I think if we think about this from a utility function, idea is like, okay, what's the worst outcome that's going to happen if I don't think about it? So I think that's really one of the most important components. And then I think another question is also is it a one-time action that I have to do? So I think that would go into it as well, right? The medication reminders, these come all pretty much every single day is something I have to do, while other things, maybe pay my taxes, I only have to do once per year. So I think here, maybe also because the timing is shorter, even though they might be more annoying and I might feel bad about having forgotten about it, the variation really comes from, okay, how important is it taking the action? How often do I think I will have to send a reminder so that this action is carried out, compared to possibly these habit reminders that we had. Maybe also here the information was just annoying because if they come every single day, you just don't need that additional information. You know, it's an important task to do. So all you need is just to be reminded to do it every single day. But I think it's a great question. I don't have a perfect answer exactly how it goes to the model, but if you're interested, actually the theoretical models we have there, we have a bit more of the different features. And I think there one could do even more about testing that in different circumstances and varying the elements.
Okay, great. We have lots of questions. So there's a very general question, which I think is very important to ask. Somebody's asking, how would you argue that this topic of research of nudging is in economics? Isn't it marketing or communications or even psychology more than economics?
I think that's a fair question. It has definitely come up. As I was trying to argue in the beginning, I think economics is the science of allocating scarce resources, and I think attention is clearly one of our scarcest resources. So I think just by definition of that, it is clearly an economics topic. But I think also here this question of public policy, which can be, obviously, as I said in the beginning, companies might do similar things as we do as policymakers. But I think the policy question is often how can we get people to live healthier, to pay their taxes, to save for retirement, to take parental leave, all these types of questions. And I think they're adding these psychological elements I think it's very important that we bring that in and don't say, okay, here's the wall between psychology and economics. If we think about it 150 years ago, it was the same thing, right? If we read Adam Smith, there wasn't really a difference also between psychology and economics. I think the difference between marketing is clearly, obviously, they want to increase company profit, and that's the particular goal. Well, as policymakers, as economists, we're interested in having different types of outcomes. But I think there's also no shame in trying to use similar types of tools, or at least trying to understand how these tools affect behavior, because we're all humans, and that's what we're interested in both sciences.
Exactly, yeah, fundamentally agree with that. The third question, knowledge of behavioral economics, specifically nudges, could lead to companies or the government meddling in the lives of consumers and citizens, taking away part of their freedom to choose. Could they make citizens behave in such a way that companies and governments maximize their profits at the cost of maximizing the utility of the people? Is there an ethical dilemma between nudges and freedom of choice? So
I would say nudges, or nudging in particular, came into policymaking as giving people more freedom of choice than actually before, right? If we think about classic policy instruments, we have regulation and mandates, we have economic incentives, and we have factual information. Information, we might claim, okay, that's for free, even though I would argue, right, it's not totally. But when we have regulation and mandates, we're very strongly affecting people's behavior. And when we set incentives, such as subsidies or taxes, we're also, in a way, meddling with people's lives. We're making very strong choices for them. So actually using nudging as this additional policy part of the policy toolkit is actually weaker, because as you've seen from the menu choices or from the reminders, you can always choose not to do that. You can still eat the meat. It's not taken off the menu. So if I would have a meat-free Monday, then, well, I'm restricting your choice. You can't have meat. If you're in the canteen, you have to go somewhere else. If I just put the meat at the bottom of the menu, well, you're still free to choose. So for those people with strong preferences, they can then exercise those preferences. But for the ones who might not care that much, or might have actually been procrastinating, or they often say in a survey, well, I want to change behavior, but then it doesn't really happen. So by understanding also this gap between intentions and actions, we can help people support that. But I hope what you take away also from the talk today is that I definitely think there are lots of ethical concerns, and there's several people very much discussing these, and that's why making these welfare calculations, trying to understand how much affecting people's behavior is positive to them or not, and under which circumstances. So I think that is a super important research agenda that we should be following, but I don't think that's would be a reason not to do it, but much more of a reason to say we need much more research on this and trying to understand this better.
Thank you. Let me move to the next question. In economics, we think of the prices should change behavior. So what is most important here, economic incentives or nudging? It's an interesting question about the difference. You know, there might be some slight, or not that slight difference between nudging and economic incentives.
Yes, I think it's a great question. So it's also something I'm working on a new project right now where I actually want to look at electricity pricing. So there, all over the world, we see that most policymakers are very positive about, well, if we have just day pricing, right? So if we change the price based on the spot market or something, we can shift people's consumption. So if we make the price cheaper at night, more people will use their washing machine at night. And what we see in practice is that this doesn't happen at all. So people's demand is absolutely flat and nothing happens. But then the very early nudge I showed about the social comparisons, we see that they're actually the change in electricity consumption that comes from that nudge is similar to about a 20% increase in prices in terms of electricity consumption reduction for that group. So here we say that we would need actually a very large change in prices in order to get the same effect that we get from the social comparison. But again, I think this is very context dependent. In some situations, incentives are going to be stronger or also more straightforward. And obviously, and this we discuss at length in the paper and the use of green nudges in environmental policy instruments, really the difference. When is a tax more appropriate and when is a nudge more appropriate? Because obviously taxes also have distributional effects. So we can use the money for something else. So there's other things that happen. But I think very importantly here is also that sometimes it will just not be possible to use a price. For example, I've done nudging with primary school students to finish their food and not waste too much food in the canteen. I don't think under any circumstances would we want to tax students for food that they haven't eaten, but maybe having smaller serving utensils or cutting the meat up in smaller pieces is probably a much better way forward to reduce food waste than trying to price that in at the person who's actually creating the externality.
Thank you. So we have several other questions, and I apologize to those who I'm not going to take time to ask you all the questions. I will close with one last question. Somebody is interested in on whether you could gauge how large tend to be tax or welfare laws due to unsubscriptions, or in general, what's the size of these costs compared to the potential benefits of the charity's revenue, for example, or other metrics there.
You were breaking up a little bit. So the question is how large the welfare loss for the charity was compared to the benefit. Was that the question, or in general?
Yes, okay. But in general.
Yes. So
yeah.
So as in the detailed case in the paper, but also in general, I think here for this particular way of reminding and unsubscriptions, it depends a lot on the discount rate of the one, in a way, nudging or trying to get the donations, right? If you're very patient, then you might be losing people in the long run, and then it's a negative effect. If you're extremely impatient, let's say there's a big natural disaster and you immediately need money, then maybe sending out a lot of reminders and getting more donations, even though you're annoying a lot of people who don't want to donate anymore, that is then the right trade-off for you. But I've also, for example, worked with the Smithsonian Institution in the US. I mean, as some of you might know, they're a museum, they're over 100 years old. So for them, donations are very, very seldomly urgent. So for them, it's very important. They have this very long time horizon. Most of their donors at some point die, and they never just leave, they just die because they get so old. So I think here it's a very different trade-off. So I think that's really what we want to look at, like how urgent is this behavior? Again, paying taxes, right? If you don't pay tax, it's going to be a huge problem. So then maybe getting a few tough reminders is better than having less. But I think that's really important that we have also that's why having theoretical models behind it is also important, because then we can add these elements to it and then think about it for each individual decision.
Okay, wonderful. Christina, let me just say that it's absolutely fantastic to think about optimal design from this fresh goal, which tries to bring evidence-based to policy choices, and the applications going from areas in health and environmental sustainability, charitable, collection correctly, and things like that are absolutely useful for us development economists to think. So thank you very much. It's been great to hear about your work. Thanks for sharing.
Great, thanks for having me. And yeah, enjoy the conference, everyone.
Yes. Continue now. We will have a shorter break of 10 minutes, because in 10 minutes we start with the parallel sessions. We have 5 parallel sessions, one on refugee situation, one on informal markets, one on health, one on democracy, last one on political economy, which start in exactly 10 minutes. So everybody keep tuned in. Thanks to everybody for attending this session.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you very much, Christina.
Thank you very much, Christina.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope it was muted. Should I be muted? No.
Yeah, we hear you. Now you.
Yeah,
The host
hear you now.
the host keeps muting me. I don't know. Am I talking